ich dir noch angesäche, so bist du ihr aller Ehre. Was ist Wundes hier geschäche? Dass ein Magd ein Kind gebar, ihre über aller Engel Schar. Was das nicht ein Wunder gar.
This is The New Right, a podcast for the lost arts, reclaiming the literary Holy Land from the heathen. This is Matt Pegas.
And this is Dan Baltic.
And we are back here with another episode, our first episode of 2022, with our first recurring guest, Last Things. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure to be here, guys. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no, very good to have you back. Obviously, this is the second collaboration between New Right and Last Things. The first one I was unfortunately absent for, but I did enjoy the conversation you and Dan did. But I think we wanted to get you back on, A, because the first conversation was so good, but B, I definitely, had some of my own things I wanted to talk to you about. So, yeah, very, very good to have you back. And this may seem a little bit like repeat or like a step backwards or something based on the conversation you already had with Dan. But I just thought maybe I want to talk a little bit more about your work today. I feel like the first interview was a little bit of you interviewing Dan about New Right, and maybe this interview informally is us interviewing you about Last Things. So I thought maybe just start off by you kind of telling us a little bit about your project, how it came to be. I can intro it a little bit. You're a YouTube video essayist, and a very good one. Some very high production quality and insightful videos. But if you just want to talk about your project a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. And Matt, I did read Dragon Day, so I'm happy to.
Oh, thank you.
I'm happy to talk about my content, but I hope we can talk about your book as well. But
we will.
But yeah, so my YouTube channel is called Last Things. I like to think about it as a pervert's guide to cinema for the dissident right. I've been described as kind of a right-wing Adam Curtis. So my typical format has kind of been to pick a philosophical idea or a philosophical personality or some subject and try to explain it through the lens of a film, a work of film or a television program. I say that as though I'm prolific. I've got one 3-part series, and I've got two videos that come in about under an hour, and I'm chiseling away at my fourth, which I was really hoping to get out the door before J.R.R. Tolkien Day last week. It has to do with Tolkien and Lewis, but I could not make that deadline.
Yeah, that sounds really good.
Yeah. But in general, I guess I try to come at things from a dissident right or post-liberal perspective. So, that's probably all that needs to be said as to why the three of us are interested in conversation.
For sure. No, as I said, the videos are great, and it's hard to be super prolific. Some of these people will release YouTube videos all the time, but like when I watch your videos, it's very evident that they're the product of a lot of thought and a lot of work. They are video essays. This is not you, speaking off the cuff on something. It's these are real, fully fledged video essays. So the amount of time and work that you put into them definitely shows. And it's interesting you say Adam Curtis. I'm something of a Curtis fan. I never really made that connection between you and him, but yeah, I can see that there's a similar sort of editing sensibility, I feel, because when you make these videos, you have a real collage of different pictures and sound effects and even music, and it comes together really nicely.
I'll be honest, I hadn't even checked until somebody told me I was the right wing Adam Curtis. I hadn't even heard about the guy, but then I went and checked him out, and I was like, oh yeah, okay. I guess they're right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Yeah.
it really fits. Like, I didn't think of it either, but now that I'm like remembering the Curtis docs I've watched and your videos, like, there is a similarity in style and in substance.
Yeah, and
Yeah, I mean,
I don't mean to no shade against Curtis, but I do think he consider himself a man of the left.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
yeah. No, there's issues with Curtis. I mean, he's obviously of the left, but also there's a certain meandering quality, whereas yours are pretty pointed points of view. And I mean, was the Distributist somewhat of an influence? I know you've done streams with the Distributist, but
very much so. Honestly, I mean, I'm always giving Dave kudos, I guess, but I kind of attribute him to both my slow lurch rightward from my shit lib days. He was somebody that started to take on a lot of the kind of classical lib personalities online, and I would find that he just kind of bested them, and he led me to pick up a lot of just kind of right-wing political theory, and introduced me to Mencius Moldbug, and sent me down the rabbit hole, so to speak. And I think eventually, I think he did just kind of inspire. I felt like I was having enough ideas about videos in my mind that I decided to try my hand at one.
Yeah, no, that's definitely shows as an influence. Yeah, he's great, obviously, Distributist, and I think probably some of our listeners would be familiar. But it's like a whole, I don't know, subgenre of YouTube video are these video essays, and they're again, they're cut above the speaking off the cuff on a topic. I mean, these are really, it's like, you're basically reading a philosophy paper. But to get into your videos a little bit, I first came across your work. It's actually the same place that I met Dan, and the same place that this podcast came from. I came across your work first on Justin Murphy's forum. I remember, I think it was like April, May of last year, maybe June, when you first posted. Actually, not your first video essay, but maybe perhaps your most watched, your three-parter. The Boys and the War on the Third Way, which I was immediately sucked into, both for the production qualities we've talked about, but also just how philosophically astute it was, shall we say. And I think I commented on the forum, like, it's the way that you break down the connections you make between third positionism / the third way, whether or not there's a difference there, the connection, the way that you sum up what that is politically and philosophically, which I may ask you to do for our audience in a moment, but that, and also speaking about art and the state of TV, and this particular TV show, The Boys, was really masterfully done. And these are relevant topics, like what is the third position, and defining that is very relevant, and also talking about how kind of politics influences art and movies and TV and cinema, and why more particular points of view, or even nationalistic points of view, may lead to better art. These are relevant arguments, and I really honestly can't think of, like, your video on that is one of the best summings up of it that I've seen. But not to get too far ahead of ourselves, if you don't mind, hopefully not too much of this podcast will be making you rehash things you've already spoken about, but it seems like the kind of third way politics you describe in that video are pretty much your own. I don't want to speak for you, and kind of the politics that undergird not just that video, but your project in general. So do you want to give a quick rundown of the third way?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And we can call it, I mean, honestly, my first draft of the video and the script, it was called the Boys and the War on the Third Position. The challenge with this, and really it's just kind of an insurmountable one, is third positionism is something that really unfortunately just becomes a synonym for fascism, just as a result of the 20th century. So in a nutshell, you got first position, which is capitalism, second position, which is communism, and third position, which would be typically sort of governments which control fascism. And I'm not trying to dodge the bullet because fascism certainly would fit under the umbrella of third positionism. But it would be nation states maintaining some level of control over capitalism so it's sort of a blending. It has socialist economic policies because it's trying to care for a nation state and a particular people, a particular polis, but it has capitalist elements as well, and that it's not entirely egalitarian or redistributive. And a lot of it came out of, kind of early third position and third way political and economic theory came out of a lot of Catholic thinkers and Catholic theology. That's speaking of Dave the Distributist. He's certainly someone that introduced me to writers like G.K. Chesterton and Hilaire Belloc. They're two writers I mentioned in the video, and they are people that worked to develop it. And I think, if I recall correctly, third way is honestly something that Chesterton coined only because of this association with fascism. And I think it actually it's funny that it's so difficult to talk about. You can't really discuss the third position without being pigeonholed, or if people know what it means, they're gonna gasp and have a sharp insight.
Right. Well, I think in the third part of The Boys in the War on the Third Way, you sum up really well how, for whatever reason, we've kind of been conditioned to think of anything that dares to be both anti-communist and also anti-capitalist or anti-modernity, American capitalist hegemony, however you want to put it. There's very much a conditioning where we're led to think, anything that stands against those two things, anything that speaks of getting in touch back with any sort of rootedness or national culture in a deeper way than, obviously there are kind of national capitalists in the United States who are considered a little differently. But if you anywhere to the right of that in terms of focusing on any sort of rootedness, immediately in a very cartoonish way, and a lot of it is thanks to Hollywood and shows like The Boys, evidently, the image of Nazis is immediately presented as like that's what lies around the corner.
Yes, but I think that I would say that part of the tragedy of The Boys is, you're at the polarity, the Overton windows that we're allowed to kind of exist under. I hesitate to call it a dialectic because I don't really think there's ever any synthesis. Is on the one, the absolute good under sort of our thought regime is just sort of radical individualism and freedom, and on the opposite end of that spectrum, the antithesis of that is simply the Nazi. And the tragedy of The Boys was, at least throughout season 1, I thought it did a fantastic job of just lampooning and tearing to shreds the image of radical individualism. For those of you, we don't have to rehash the whole show, but it's basically just a parody of Marvel movies and comic book culture. And the real heart and soul of the series is this character Homelander, who's this, I think, this brutal satire. He's sort of a hybrid of Captain America and Superman, except instead of being this sort of patriotic, homegrown, like corn-fed Iowa, like blue-blooded, heroic figure, he's just this kind of pathologically narcissistic sociopath who's obsessed with his social media presence and is a complete and florid kind of neurotic, which I think just gives us a much more accurate portrait of the kind of human beings that evolve out of this wholehearted embracing of a kind of radical individualism. And it did, I think it was an incredibly smart show, and it did an incredibly beautiful job of, I just think, tearing down and thank God, finally, hallelujah, somebody satirized the dark of cinema that we're living through. And then but however, it's a bit of a bait and switch, because what happens in season 2, not to be too many spoilers, but essentially there's just, if you're allowed to sort of sneer at this sort of capitalist radical individualism, the villain of the series is quickly and again, well, not, and very subtly transformed to be a figure of a Nazi, and
Right.
a Nazi supervillain reveals themselves, and not even just a kind of the most ham-fisted, cartoonish
Yeah.
Nazi that I've ever seen, outside of like a Mel Brooks film. And it's just, I mean, that's the reason why I was originally planning on doing, I think, one video just in praise of the show, and I was like, oh, thank God somebody had the balls to finally, step on the cake, so to speak. And then season 2 came out, and I said, oh, I can't tear the show up.
Yeah. Well, I mean,
did it to me.
It's a shame that the show went down the tubes, but it makes your video essay kind of more dynamic, where there's, you praise it to a point, and then it also becomes a critique of it. And it's because it's not just the boys. It's endemic in the culture, both in Hollywood, but also in the political rhetoric of the times, where it's always this notion that there's fascists behind things, or that you have American capitalism, which has all its excesses and people are suffering because of it, but really what's behind that is some kind of fascistic white male notion, which I try to be nuanced about these things. Obviously you Last Things are pretty nuanced about this. Like, you take a certain amount of influence from certain left-wing thinkers in terms of economics, but like that kind of leftism where you're finding essentially Nazis behind every corner, I feel pretty confident is just saying is entirely fictitious and basically a myth, a politically useful myth to the powers that be, to always to say that there's always a threat of this kind of World War II type of scenario happening if people.
Yeah. I guess if we attempt to define our identities using any sort of any
people or history or culture,
yeah,
it just leads to super powered Nazis.
Yeah,
I think it's increasingly harder and harder to sell, which I guess is maybe a bit of a white pill or something that's positive. I doubt too many people found the Stormfront, the Nazi character, to be frightening or believable or I guess cleverly deployed.
Yeah.
Well,
Was the
I
show
think that's a white pill, but also it's a relevant point that when people make Nazis and those type of characters as cardboard villains, it's bad art. So The Boys, as you know, it started out very, very interesting because it was dynamic and it was asking intelligent questions. But then when you resource to cardboard villains for ideological reasons, but also out of laziness, it creates a show that is just not as good as it could be artistically, to say nothing of the political message.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I would second that, everything Dan.
Yeah,
but I mean, I imagine I did not hear a lot of other people react to it, but I imagine that there had to be people other than me that just felt their intelligence to be kind of insulted.
Yeah, I mean, even people on the other side of the aisle to us politically, you would think would find that to be a very cardboard, portrayal of. And I have to be cards up. I have not seen The Boys. Based on your recommendation, it sounds like the first season is very much worth watching. But in any case, it sounds like the first season, regardless of where one stands politically, it sounds like the first season had a lot more to offer. It was a lot less of a sort of straw man, cardboard villain kind of setup. And yet there is this, you could call it the tragedy of The Boys, because it sounds like, and I'm going to loop this in with your unique, political perspective as an advocate of the third way. Basically, again, not having seen the show, I now plan to watch it, but the first season, it seems like it was parodying it was a satire of the effects of liberalism and liberalism writ large, liberalism in the more politically serious sense of both economic liberalism, capitalism, as well as social liberalism. It seems like it was a general satire of that, which the power of that is that there are people on the left side of the aisle who can see something in that, that they can understand and that makes sense to them. But there's also people on the right who can see something in it. And from those two perspectives together is where you get something like a third way type position. And yeah, lo and behold, it doesn't have to be fascism. All it has to be is a simple acknowledgement that both the only starting point is an acknowledgement that both unfettered capitalism and also unfettered social liberalism have kind of wreaked havoc on society and in our lives and have led to this atomized situation. Very basic, and I would even say very obvious observation to make about the state of the West. And if enough people make that make that observation on either side of the aisle, there could be a possibility for a real third way type political movement. Now, I happen to be a little bit black-pilled about the prospects of that, given the current climate of extreme polarization, where again there's these narrative devices put in by unsavory powers that be, where it's like, you can't drift at all towards the right socially, or it's going to be fascism, or even on the other side to an extent, you can't drift at all towards the left economically, or it's going to be communist. It's a very bad and polarized time for that. So I'm a little black-pilled about the real prospects, but you would think, given the state of things, that there really would be a future for the third way.
I've heard I forget where I know I'm quoting somebody or paraphrasing somebody, but I've heard it said that often what sort of conservative or right-leaning people want truly, fundamentally and primarily is more than any kind of right-wing conservative or libertarian economics is really right-wing social values. But under neoliberalism, all you really get is more liberal economic policy. And what left-leaning people want, even more than they want kind of left-leaning, this is in general, broadly, middle America, what they want more than liberal social values is liberal economic policy. But all they wind up getting is liberal, an increased hedonism and increased sort of permissiveness to the culture. And so neither side really fully ultimately winds up getting what they want, or what they primary.
Like the polls, routinely show that there's the most support for a third way type party, for socially conservative but more economically liberal party. And it's astounding that we've never been offered that, at least not recently. I mean, you could argue that Huey Long, in a sense, tried to, but
I think Trump tried to, but maybe didn't succeed.
Also there.
Yeah. And who knows how sincere he was, but
in retrospect,
that I don't think I have a hard opinion on it, but yeah, I mean, it would really just be giving both sides what they fundamentally want at the end of the day. But no, it's very difficult and challenging to have these conversations with anybody. I mean, God forbid you mention third positionism and you Google it, because it's just, I mean, I decided to edit it back to third way because I in just doing research for my video, third position in Google gives you, you're reading about Adolf Hitler and about two, because that's the only end result of any kind of between unchecked liberalism and communism. So it's a challenge. One thing I've thought about because I always encounter this, I don't even know what words to use if I'm trying to have a conversation with a normie. And this would be a noble project for New Right.
Yeah.
Anybody on our side of things. Do you guys know what like the Devil's Dictionary is?
No.
It's a satirical dictionary written by Ambrose Bierce, who was like a Civil War soldier. It just has like it, it's a dictionary, but every word, every definition is actually just kind of satirical and biting. So
Yeah.
I'm looking at
It's kind of like Urban Dictionary a little bit, or like, but predating that.
yeah, it's like, but I would
Yeah.
love like because one of the challenges that dissidents had is anybody that Googles any term that we use is just going to get Rational Wiki or a BuzzFeed article that explains this is Nazi signaling or this is
Yeah.
something like that. But to create something and then try to actually boost it, where you had like the Devil's Dictionary of, like what is
That's a great
what
idea.
is- if somebody could Google third positionist and it just looks up like somebody who seeks to define themselves outside of market forces politically, like
Gosh, I mean, I'm going to earmark that as something to maybe do. I mean,
Sure.
and maybe we could all help. I don't know, like, because there used to be something called, like, yeah, and you're right. You look it up, you get Rational Wiki, you get various low rent news articles that explain how everything is ultimately fascism. And there, on the other side, there used to be, I think, something called like Imperium Wiki. Maybe it's still like this. You have kind of more like Wignat types who make their own versions of this that don't really help that much at the end of the day. But is there room for a kind of a more moderate / just like more objective and like less of an agenda, just trying to give a more honest account of the different the different currents in sort of dissident thought, shall we say. I think that
I have two angles on it too. I would love it if people just gave like more humorous and honest and sane definitions. I also just like I would always notice this, that I was just getting liberal definitions of my terms when I Google stuff, but like I would love an etymological study of certain, like I love based. I love based. Just the term. It's
Yeah.
just so
Yeah.
awesome. But like where did it pop up? Like can anybody track down the first like meme when it became a meme? Like when did it first like enter into like the dissident space as a term?
If I'm not mistaken, it's from a Lil B song, like a rapper,
Yeah,
which is ironic. I bet perhaps.
It's hard to know whatever what like to I guess put a timestamp on something, but it would be wonderful if somebody had just sort of like the history of Based.
I mean, there's knowyourmeme.com, but I don't know if there's an article on Based. I think what's interesting, and not to get too much on a sidetrack about this, but I think what's interesting about Based is that, yes, I think it's from that Lil B song, but at the same time, it sounds like what the way it's used by the dissident sphere also like makes sense. It's like based, it's rooted, it's it's like based in reality essentially. So I think that's why it exploded. I think a few people are like, haha, this song is funny. Wouldn't it be funny to say this about like dissident right types?
Yeah.
But I think that it really exploded because it seems to. So you could, from like a linguistic perspective, you could argue that it maybe the idea was from the Little B song, but at the same time, it kind of grew to mean based in reality. That's essentially what it does mean now. But yeah, no, I think
bored right wing autist like philologists sitting around.
Yeah, which there are many of, is my impression. These kinds of intellectual pursuits are not uncommon among kind of people in our sphere, like that kind of more autistic type stuff. And I don't mean that in a bad way.
Of our universe.
The what?
You need scholars.
Yeah, no, there's like so many of them, and also like regular scholars. Evidently, if listen to like BAPS podcasts and whatnot all the time, it's like such and such dissident academic who is under a false name. I mean, they're out there. But to pull us back on track a little bit, the other thing I wanted to ask in regard to the Boys series, another thing to unpack. You kind of talked about third way politics, but another really memorable part of that video series is just want to kind of rehash what is it about kind of cultural particularity, potentially a third way type regime that you think would lead to greater art. I mean, in your video you talk about like Italian neorealism as an example of a very culturally rooted artistic tradition. If you just want to touch on that briefly, because I think it's
and I was thinking about it before we we went live, because I wish I had a holistic and totalizing theory behind this, and maybe the three of us can patch it together right now, but yeah, I guess the point that I make in the video is, I am a kind of a film snob. I'm like a stereotypical film studies major from a liberal arts college, a Criterion collection adorned walls, and I'll geek out about French New Wave, and then Italian neorealism or German expressionism, and I guess I kind of treat it the way a lot of people treat cuisine. There is just these kind of unique tastes, sort of unique aesthetic motifs that run alongside nations, and that particularly, I guess that's probably not so much the case nowadays, although I still think there's still a really strong national Korean going. That's basically the only movies I bother watching today. But in general, the heyday was really the 1960s. I guess what I allude to in the video is that you need a certain kind of national pride or national patriotism, and to have an aesthetic, and these differences and these kind of beautiful, genuine, authentic diversity of cinema is something that's just gotten more and more kind of homogenized and turned into gray goo, especially, Cape shit, the rise of Cape shit culture. I can't, but at the same time, I can't say that this is the formula for decent cinema. Third positionist countries certainly fail on any number of levels, economically, morally, and aesthetically. Obviously, Mussolini had crappy propaganda films, and so I don't think it's any guarantor.
Right.
I have to say that sometimes, I guess there's maybe two kind of categories. There's, I guess, movies that kind of stick to a certain place, like Italian cinema or German cinema, Japanese cinema, and then there's also things that are just kind of rooted to a particular time. I certainly can't think of a movie like Back to the Future, which I think I touch on briefly in my video. I don't think it's something that's going to make it into the Criterion collection. That's certainly a movie that was produced when we were well on our way to kind of a globalized cinema, but it's a great movie, and I have
right
a lot of fondness for it. And I do think that it does sort of hit on just sort of 1980s Americana, and a lot of the things that something like Stranger Things is playing on the nostalgia for. So I can certainly find movies that don't adhere to some sort of patriotism that I'm capable of admiring. But I do just look at the kind of global cinema and global television of today, and I think what it makes me immediately hungry for is just, like an actual subject rooted to a particular time and a particular place.
Yeah.
Trying to say something to me as opposed to sell something to me. And
no, absolutely. I don't want to, obviously on this podcast, we love our sort of right-wing artists, filmmakers, writers, but the point isn't simply, right-leaning people make better art. That's not necessarily the point. Because with a lot of the filmmakers that you mentioned, I don't even know, I probably don't know nearly as much about it as you, but those Italian neorealists, certainly the American sort of new Hollywood filmmakers who you do praise in the movie, in your video, as being another example of this, even the George Lucases of the world, maybe not the newer Star Warses, but the older, and this, perhaps, I don't know if you mentioned Spielberg by name, but you mentioned even them, even what a lot of people would see as filmmakers who later sort of led to where we are now. Nevertheless, there is something rooted and in of a particular time and place about New Hollywood. Even my point is, those people are not right wing people at all. In as far as they're patriotic, it's they a lot of, in the case of New Hollywood, a lot of them very anti-Vietnam War. You don't need to be jingoistic to make good art by a long shot, but it's less even about what you profess as just the simple rootedness of the filmmakers, even just like the life of the filmmaker who made the film. It's like those societies produce better artists, not that people who advocate the third way make better art or anything, but societies that maintain some degree of rootedness.
Yeah, I mean, I think in some ways, the generation under the influence, the 60s, 70s era American auteur filmmakers are the biggest kind of fly in my ointment, because I think those guys were. I'm thinking of films like Easy Rider, or anything that early Jack Nicholson films. Those are kind of simultaneously kind of anti-American American cinema.
I think
they
what
are.
it boils down to is authenticity. It's not about patriotism or necessarily culture or root. Well, it is about culture and rootedness. But like, for instance, I recently watched one of, Russia has been making a lot of films recently, blockbusters. And, they're kind of in this, like, from the Russian perspective during World War II. And like, because Russia has a lot of money now, they're really pretty good, the production value. But it's shit. It's just, it is patriotic, but it's poorly written because it's inauthentic. It's like, it's propaganda. So patriotism is good, it's great, but what we really need to produce good art, I think, is authenticity. And so that is like, you are being true to the culture that it came from, the place that it came from. And so I think that is why Easy Rider is a fly in your ointment, because it's not patriotic, but it is authentic.
Yeah.
It is an authentic portrayal of the culture at that moment. And it's not bullshitting you.
That's well said, Dan. And it's funny too. I mean, I think what we also need is the thing that all of those directors had, like Sam Altman, all of those guys, Dennis Hopper, is they just had maverick millionaires that would write a check. They had the guys that were just like, I don't know what the kids are into these days, but this guy seems like he's it, and here, like, go run and make your movie, man.
Oh, absolutely. The age of the auteur, was very real in 70s Hollywood.
We're talking a lot about the challenges that faced you guys, or anybody that's kind of writing from a particularly right wing, or even just kind of a unapologetically masculine point of view in the publishing industry. But a subject that they came on, I was on Millennial Woes Millennial this year, and one thing that we wound up talking about was just like the tragedy. This parallels the tragedy of literature right now, but just think about all of the amazing movies that will never get made about the absurd inflection point of where we are at culturally. And this ties back to the tragedy of The Boys, because I think The Boys in many ways came as close as anything to putting its finger on the button of a lot of that bullshit. But there's just, there's never going to be a movie where you're just like, oh yeah, that movie just explains exactly how like fake and gay the 20 teens were. Like, it's just never going to happen.
Yeah.
Peter Thiel, if you're listening, we need money to make movies. Peter.
No, I mean, look,
I'm zero HP Lovecraft screenplay, and I'm guaranteed the man's probably got like a shoebox full of them being produced. I don't care if it's in some like weird warehouse in Eastern Europe. Somebody's got to be producing a zero HP Lovecraft film.
Yeah,
definitely.
Well, we were going to ask sort of about that, like, I was going to kind of comment, like, obviously you do a really good job in your videos, and on this podcast now, we're talking about it, why movies today basically suck, why TV, basically sucks, art, there's a downward trend in quality. But obviously, you're still talking about some of this stuff. A lot of it still brings up interesting points, at least, whether it's The Boys or I also really like your video on Black Mirror, which maybe we'll get into. But yeah, I guess two-pronged question. I mean, do you have that much hope? Oh, let's just, rather than being broad, I'll just say for movies. I mean, do you have much hope that, you know, things could improve for movies in the United States moving forward? And I guess along with that, like, what are some of the better things you've seen, I would say movies and TV, over the past few years, if there's anything that even comes to mind?
Oh man. You know, well, I mean, the short answer to that question is sadly no. But you know, even if I find something good, and I guess this is something I touch on with both the Boys video and the Black Mirror episode, is even, and this is, I think, I write and I talk a lot about horror movies. And I think that in a very strange, I guess, kind of counterintuitive, maybe paradoxical way, the most horrifying thing that I see in any kind of intellectual property nowadays is, even if something does catch me, even if I do think something is resonating with me, I'm waiting for it to shift leftward in some way.
Yeah.
Even if I can't even. The moment I find myself getting caught up in a show or a TV, I'm like, what? Like, when is the sequel going to come out? And like, are they're going to, like, I'm going to get excited about this, and there's episode 7 is going to introduce some character that's just obviously whatever that type of character was supposed to be, like a Montana sheriff as a black woman or something.
Yeah.
Something is going to come and spoil my meal.
Yeah.
Like, I think you were mentioning Wheel of Time, like fantasy series, and on Twitter, and like, the multiracial casting. You know, it's, you know, obviously, you know, intentionally done to fulfill political ends and not artistic ends. And I mean, it's not to say you can't have fantasy movies with, you know, a multiracial cast, but when it's done solely for that reason, it's just, you know, it's lazy and it's boring.
Yep. That and your Guillermo del Toro style villain coming in, which sort of happens in The Boys, except surprise, she's a female. Anyway.
Yes. I mean, to not be overly cynical, I mean, I think, like I said, Korea has some great stuff. I thought Parasite was an excellent.
Yeah. Wait, just to butt in, I mean, I'm curious what your answer is here. Did you see Squid Game?
I did, yeah, and I thought it was trying to be a Bong Joon-ho film. I thought he was going to be an executive producer on it.
Right. Well, here's the thing. I'm not going to overly heap praise on the Squid Game, but I'll say this. For a show that everyone was watching, I mean, normally when everyone's watching something, it's either bad or like good but stupid. I mean, like the last couple of times that it happened with a Netflix show was Stranger Things and Tiger King. Stranger Things, you know, I do keep up with Stranger Things because, you know, for whatever reason, but I think it's very derivative. Tiger King was entertaining but pretty dumb. Of those three shows I just mentioned, the meme Netflix shows, Squid Game is, I think, by far the best. I think there was some sort of redemptive quality there, and when you said that Korea kind of had a thing going, it reminded me a bit of that. Like, there is more, you know, Squid Game is not very woke at all, and it is kind of rooted in this new Korean thing that's going on. And look, I don't want to like sidetrack us about Squid Game too much. I was curious what your thoughts were, because I thought that it was a lot better than I was expecting.
Yeah. No, it was good. It was but again, it just made me kind of want to watch
Bong Joon-ho
host, and I recently did a guest spot on Tyler Hamilton's channel where we did a deep dive on Host, which is
interesting. Yeah.
But I don't think that I think that part of Korea is still, I guess, angry enough at America and therefore sort of imperial culture that they managed to, you know, poke the bear with a stick every now and again.
Yeah.
Art.
I think
now,
so.
What do you think about a couple of the more recently produced movies that some have said are right-wing or based? And like, for instance, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood
Hmm.
or The King, and I love both of those movies. And I realized that they both pass and fail your test of rootedness because Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is quite rooted to the era, the 70s, 60s when it was made, well, when it was set. But obviously it's not of the moment today. And The King, of course, that's King Henry V. So that's at the end of the Hundred Years' War. So that's definitely not today. And it occurs to me, even as I'm saying this, that it may be the case that actual authenticity cannot be achieved in movies that are made today because you will get canceled if you try to make an authentic movie based with today as its setting. But you can do it from in previous eras.
Yeah,
it's scary there.
That's a great question, Dan, and I will answer that. I guess part of it kind of ties back to Matt mentioning Stranger Things. We're all literature guys. I don't know if you guys ever read like William Gaddis's The Recognitions. It's about a great forger, a painting forger, a guy who does facsimiles of masterpieces. So much so that they can't actually be told apart. Like he can do a Goya painting and it looks exactly like Goya, and so he's very sought after by art art outlaw. But that's sort of that. It's one thing that's I guess a bit tragic is the best that we can hope for aesthetically is these perfect facsimiles of a bygone. Like, oh, you just crushed 80s aesthetics, but it is this simulacrum of an 80s movie.
You just crushed Renaissance aesthetics.
It's like watching home movies of you and an old girlfriend. It's not like immediate. It's not you can't celebrate it in the same way. Quentin Tarantino is I don't know what to do with him because he's obviously a master, but I don't know if you guys ever followed Joel Davis. I would love to do a stream with Joel Davis on Tarantino. He apparently has this concept. I'm not sure if he developed it in his journal Firstness or if he has videos on it, but I've heard him kind of talk obliquely about it called ontological coolness and describing the characters and the protagonists of Tarantino films as capable of achieving this authenticity through this kind of detached coolness. It's probably obvious, I'm sure you have characters springing to mind. And I wouldn't deny that. I'm really curious and interested to hear Joel develop that more. And I can't deny that Tarantino's, probably one of the 3 greatest living filmmakers. But I guess the alternative view, I guess the dissident right critique of Tarantino, and I guess I can somewhat see this, and I somewhat agree on this, even though I'm not a big racialist guy. Like that's not my camp of the dissident right at all. But there is a component of Tarantino's movies that often contains, I guess, a certain racialized violence. If we're talking about the cartoonishness of the Nazi in the Nazi in The Boys, then it brings to mind the cartoonishness of Leonardo DiCaprio's Southern plantation owner, the sort of cartoonish revenge of the Inglourious Bastards against the Nazis.
And, for sure, and Django.
There seems to be this, and again, I hate talking about it. It's not even something that necessarily riles me up, but there does seem to be this preoccupation. I don't think that Tarantino knows really what to do with his own whiteness, if that makes sense.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah, no, because I like Tarantino a lot, but what you say, I don't know what to do with him. I know what you mean because I don't really know quite how to regard some of that stuff either. He does it in a way that somehow, I guess, because he is such a good filmmaker and the violence is frankly very entertaining. no matter, Inglourious Bastards, Django, whatever, that like it's easier for me to stomach than it is in a lot of other things. But in some ways, he's actually a progenitor of some of the worst instincts that we now see.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
The best thing I've heard said about Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, and it was wonderful. It was a great movie. Like I needed it. You occasionally just get these extinction bursts of great cinema.
Oh, and I definitely think Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is
but
almost self-consciously an extinction burst. But go on.
It's I read this somewhere. Again, I'm paraphrasing somebody or someone else, but they said that the two characters, the Brad Pitt character and the DiCaprio character is someone who's seeking authenticity through artifice, and the Brad Pitt character is seeking becoming artifice through his authenticity. They have strange polar trajectories, because you have just like a true blue-blooded cowboy in Brad Pitt, and you have this actor who's desperately attempting to kind of have that quality. And I think that can be said about all of his movies. Like they're simultaneously like playing with genre and cliche and pulp, and yet transcending that at the same time. So
that's a very good point.
And I guess I can't, so I don't know how to talk about the politics of the movie either.
No, I hear what you're saying.
Sorry, I don't mean to sidetrack us, but
no, I'm glad to talk about Tarantino. I think Dan and I have, I don't know, I've kind of wanted to have the Tarantino conversation on this podcast for a while, and it'll probably continue in other episodes because he's definitely relevant. Just to go back before we move on to like the next question or whatever, I did think you made a really interesting point. I mean, I've seen most of your video essays at this point, maybe all of them actually, but my favorite ones are the one on the boys that we've talked about, and also your essay on Black Mirror, what you call the scariest episode of Black Mirror you ever saw, which is the abominable Star Trek sort of based one. Yeah. And you bring up a really interesting point that like you get a lot of mileage out of talking about The Boys and talking about Black Mirror, which both of them are flawed shows. But the flaw almost becomes like a meta narrative about the film, which is like, when, as you said, when is it going to go woke? Obviously it happens with The Boys, and your video on Black Mirror. I don't want to spoil this video because you do a really good job of kind of building to your point. What's that?
You can. It's fine. Don't worry about it.
But it's such a it is a point of equality that I want to make it. I mean, I think a lot of people have seen the show Black Mirror. I'm certainly a fan of the earlier stuff, and will probably continue to watch the shittier stuff that's coming out just out of habit. But basically, it's a show that started as this kind of much darker Twilight Zone-esque anthology series, mostly, criticizing modern man's relation to technology, and doing so in a really, really compelling and frankly very disturbing way, including the second episode, which you talk a lot about. What's that one called? It's like
15 Million Merits.
15 Million Merits. I'm not going to sit here and rehash that whole episode. Some of our audience will probably have seen it. That being a really good example of a great episode involving, basically, to sum it up really briefly, someone in a sort of technologically totalitarian society ultimately getting completely sort of co-opted, trying to rebel, but then even having that rebellion sort of co-opted and turned into yet another commercial product. Is the sort of abstract of what happens in that episode. And then your point in your video, the scariest episode of Black Mirror I ever saw, is basically that more or less happened to Black Mirror itself. That originally there was more sort of revolutionary potential, that this was a show that was actually touching some uncomfortable spots in the culture, and then it got bought by Netflix, which is never a good thing. And it's not something that it went woke, but in this episode, that is basically, sort of Star Trek inspired, so to speak. Again, people should just go watch the video. I'm not going to take all the time to.
I think where the real sea change occurs, the name of that episode is the USS Callister, where it's just it was never a show that and wore any form of politics on its sleeve, and then it just suddenly became propaganda. It really did. It was
Yeah.
it lacked it, and it was desaturated of its horror, which I think is the most horrifying thing. And that's, I guess, that's why it's hard for me to answer your earlier question of just, good films, good um, good movies, good TV shows, because you are waiting for this form of culture jamming, and it's hard for me to tell how. I mean, I guess it's certainly deliberate, but there are so many different levels on which it functions as well. Because now, like, if I try to have if I want to talk to a coworker about The Boys, and they're like, "Oh, do you watch The Boys?" And if I say, "Yeah, I like The Boys," well, am I agreeing to the fact that Nazism is the greatest threat to human flourishing in the world,
Mm-hmm.
or am I acknowledging the brilliant satire of Cape Shit?
Yeah.
And the same is true of Black Mirror. I think that you could, easily guess by somebody admiring Black Mirror that they have a pretty dark and nihilistic take on technology, and now you probably just assume that
They're just another Netflix watcher.
The real horror is that this is something that happens within intellectual properties. I mean, I think, like, it's funny.
Yeah.
I would love to do it. I think it's probably been commented on to death, although I'd love to do a video on it. I used to be like the lone defender of the British Office. But
Yeah.
the difference between the British Office and the American Office, which always offended me. This is at least two, I think, very distinct products. Is the British Office really felt like every office job I'd ever had, and the protagonist is unlikely to get the girl and does not have a lantern jaw, and there is this discomfort. You don't want to be in the office, and it has the sort of a tragedy of office life. And then you have the American Office, which is the fun, like the most exciting, fun environment on the planet.
Yeah, it's like people's comfort show of choice. Everyone's always like, I wish I lived in the office. I wish I, like that. It's like, you hear that all the time.
Yeah, but I think the way that was handled, it became Americanized, and it.
Oh yeah, that's yeah.
They make Ed Krasinski the kind of the underdog who's not an.
Right. Oh man, I could fucking talk about maybe I'm not alone in this. I could talk about The Office, and by the way, I may like the American Office more than you. I'm like, not all my opinions are negative, but my God, we could do a whole nother show on that. Like, not necessarily saying we should, but
I think that it has merit, but I guess what I'm pointing to is there's this significance that I think the British Office, like Black Mirror, like The Boys, is just something that cut too close to the bone at a type of sadness that is a direct result of a kind of corporate neoliberal cultural life. And if the minute you observe that, just start counting down to the culture jamming, and it's become it's algorithmic, because the speed and the subtlety and the nuance is just accelerating to the point where I'm not going to be able to catch it, and I'm going to wake up and I'm going to be a shitlib again, because I won't notice the show is completely switched on me.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, and I never thought of it in regard to The Office, but that makes sense. The thing I was going to say about The Office, and this is to change the subject a little bit, but I'm probably going to unceremoniously use it as a transition to another thing we want to talk about today, is I think that The Office, the American Office, is probably the best example of neo-sincerity on TV. Not in general. Obviously, it's kind of neo-sincerity. You have it. Neo-sincerity, very much a 2000s thing in America. You have it with the kind of the indie rock, like the Arcade Fire type of bands of that time. And you definitely have it with writers like David Eggers and David Foster Wallace, which is the topic I'm probably going to jump to in a second. But I think that this never really occurred to me about The Office when I was like originally watching it when it was coming out, but I rewatched some of it recently and I was like, oh my god, this was like so of the moment. It was so it's that Arcade Fire aesthetic, that David Foster Wallace aesthetic, neo-sincerity, where the message is all about like the life is banal, but it's actually really wonderful, and you have to like embrace the beauty of the banality. I mean, like that was like really in the. I don't know if that's just my impression, but my impression is very much that was very in the water for whatever reason in the 2000s, and then like in the 2010s, it sort of fizzled out as, I guess, as we started to get into a more chaotic sort of cultural moment where all of a sudden the stakes seem kind of high again. But there's kind of this like post 90s thing of like, oh, we live in this corporatized world, but like. The Office really is, I think, a great example because it's like, you have this banal job, but like, what really matters is like love and friendship and all of this, which I don't mean to be too dismissive of it, but like, I really do think it's neo-sincerity. It's almost that trite. But go on.
About I don't want to interrupt you, but I've never really tried to trace Wallace's influence on other mediums. But yeah, we want to talk about Wallace, so let's talk.
We do, and I'm just going to say one last thing about The Office. Another thing about like this is, I mean, one, obviously the aesthetic is neo-sincere, like that's obvious enough. But like, indeed, John Krasinski, who incidentally also made the Quiet Place movie, which you have another good video essay about, but not even to touch on that. John Krasinski and I think B.J. Novak and I think some of the other creators of The Office did cite Wallace as an influence, so it's not mere speculation. I think that connection is there. But on the David Foster Wallace note, Dan and I think saw on Twitter yesterday that you were potentially looking to do a stream on Wallace, which maybe we could still do down the line. But Dan and I have been talking about potentially doing an episode on DFW for a while. I think that the general sense with Wallace is he around the time a few years after his suicide, he became sort of beatified in the culture. And people always looked at that Kenyon College commencement address.
This is water, yeah.
This is water, where he lays out kind of what we were talking about with The Office, a very neo-sincere type of message. But then shortly after that, he kind of there was this reaction to his beatification from across the political spectrum. I mean, I always had a very influential moment in my like personal development as a reader and as a writer was reading Bret Easton Ellis's takedown of less a takedown of Wallace, more a takedown of The End of the Tour, that very neo-sincere movie that was made about him, and basically just taking down the kind of cult of the nice guy surrounding him. That had an influence on me. I don't remember if I've talked about that. I think I've talked about it on like another podcast, but basically I was a really big David Foster Wallace fan. In high school, I was kind of one of those David Foster Wallace lit bros. Hate to admit now, but that's where I was at like 17, 18. And then I read that Ellis piece on the End of the Tour movie, and then it kind of made me reconsider how much of a sort of basically how much I'd bought into neo-sincerity as a sort of aesthetic, and that subsequently influenced my reading and writing going forward. But it's not just the Bret Easton Ellises of the world, and not that Bret Easton Ellis is necessarily right wing, but a lot of sort of people in our sphere would have a similar critique of Wallace, that he's essentially a neo-sincere weenie and overrated and pretentious.
Yeah, is he?
But also,
is he cringed? Give me the dirt. Do you consider him based or cringe? Now.
Oh, you're asking me?
Yeah.
I am going to deter the question because I'm going to deter the question because I want to give a little more background, but also because I haven't completely made up my mind. But I'll offer opinion in one sec. The other thing I was going to say, he's also obviously very much rejected by the left. And I remember there was a meme sort of towards the end of my time in college where it was like, or not even a meme, but like a BuzzFeed article, to all the men who've recommended David Foster Wallace to me. Like he was basically villainized as like the peak like cis het, white male writer.
I'm not aware of this. This is interesting. I didn't know about the left's rejection of him.
Oh, you didn't? Okay, well then I feel more validated in deterring my opinion to give more of this background. It actually there was a pretty terrible movie that came out last year called Promising Young Woman, which I don't want to get another sidetrack explaining what happens in that movie. Kind of a train wreck feminist pseudo horror movie, which would be right up your alley.
Yeah.
What's that?
I haven't seen it yet. Maybe we can do a film review on it.
Oh yeah, if you watch it, I think you'd have a lot to say. But it's like actively hard to watch. But anyway, there was someone. They made reference to David Foster Wallace as a problematic writer, even in that, and that was from last year. So this idea of him as like a problematic cishet white male writer with a bunch of problematic beta fans is still very operative. So we rejected from both sides. Do I think David Foster Wallace is cringed or based? I don't have my like 5-point essay on why he's based, but I lean towards defending Wallace. I think I'd have to reread some of it to come up with more of an opinion. But I mean, he's a masterful writer. He's not everyone's cup of tea, but he is a masterful writer. And reading the reason I liked his work in high school is because he really got you into the skin of his very sort of socially anxious and self-conscious protagonist. And his mere ability to do that, is it based? I don't know. Yeah, maybe this will be my sort of non-committal answer. Politically, he's probably a little cringe. He's kind of in that Gen X tier, like not really willing to fully take a side kind of thing. But as a writer, I think he's great, and I think that people short sell him for that. But sorry, hopefully I'm not rambling too much here. What is your take?
Ian, what's your take on him?
So I more or less echo Matt here in that I would have to go back and read. It's been years since I've read it, and I read his work during my pre-based era when I was a shitlib like everyone else, and or not like everyone else, but like many people. And as a result, like I'm not confident he was based. In fact, I think he probably politically was quite cringe because everyone had to be to get published, really. And like he is maybe based by today's standards because Matt was talking about people on the left trying to cancel him. But I mean, he was just based to the extent he was writing honestly about being a straight man. And that is something that even just doing that, like if you read, and we talked about this a little bit in the pod with the editor of Expat Press, Manuel Marrero, if you even write honestly about being a straight man, you're just going to catch a lot of heat, and people are going to say you're misogynistic or whatever, and like that is. He's not based because he was writing honestly about being a straight man. It's just like that's like what you should be doing. So like in a sense, like if we were to transport him to today, yeah, I guess politically his writing might be considered kind of based because it wasn't this kind of cringing writing that you have today where like straight men are writing fiction, which is like already a preemptive apology for what they're about to write about. And when it comes to his technical ability, though, now I don't think that is something that is really based or cringe. It's just a matter of like it is based to be good at things, sure, and he's just a phenomenal writer. He's like in my opinion one of the best writers I've ever read. And his ability to get into the minds of characters is just astounding to articulate not just thoughts, but like thoughts within thoughts and motivations. And it's really like, it's the type of book, his books, like I remember interviews with Hideous Men, collection of his short stories, Oblivion. I must admit I haven't read Infinite Jest. So I spared myself that, but yeah, it's the type of thing as a writer, as I'm reading it, I'm like, fuck, I hate you. I hate to do this.
Yeah. My it's interesting to hear you guys both talk about him because I guess I'm coming at it from I've read a lot of his short fiction. I think I've read the majority of his nonfiction. I've definitely read all of his literary criticism, his big kind of essays, E Unibus Plurum, and Westward Ho, where he kind of that's his I guess meta analysis of Western lit and where it's going and where it needs to go. But I did read Infinite Jest. I read Infinite Jest in my 20s, and I guess that's probably where I'm coming from. What gives me what makes me scratch my head about the guy. I was on it like because I honestly like I thought about trying to do like a summer course on him or do a reread of Infinite Jest, but I don't want like if I turn out not to like the man, like or I guess upon rereading him, if I just found it to be not worth it, I hate the like his death was very tragic. I don't want to be the guy who just sort of mocks his legacy. So I don't know if it's worth the investment, but I mean, I'm sure you guys are familiar with Infinite Jest, or at least the premise of Infinite Jest. And this is what kind of problematizes for me his entire notion of the new sincerity. Because, and that's not to say I don't understand what you guys are saying with, I guess, the sentimentality and the I guess the vulnerable emotionality of a show like The Office. But I mean, really quickly, I mean, so Infinite Jest is a Gravity's rainbow-sized tomb, and if anybody knows anything about it, the only thing people hear about it is the footnotes, because there are footnotes that are, it's sort of like a 0 H.P. Lovecraft tweet if they were all 80 pages, because you can flip to a footnote, and the footnote winds up being a novella, and then you have to go back to your page, and it's sort of I think another thing people have commented on it is that it's sort of it anticipated and predated like tabs on your browser.
Yeah.
Like you feel like you've got 80 tabs open when you're reading DFW because you probably have 5 bookmarks. You've got one for the page you had to leave when you began a footnote that you thought was just going to be whatever, and it just turned.
I read it on Kindle, which was a good choice. But continue.
But I mean, but other than sort of the stylistic elements, and it's it's very like dense kind of stream of consciousness, thoughts leading into thoughts, sentences going on for quite a while. The premise is basically that it's the near future in America where like Mexico, America, and Canada have formed like a mass super state, and they have collectively decided to make Quebec the dumping ground for all of their like nuclear waste. Mm-hmm. So there are these trebuchets that get described as like launching all of this stuff into Quebec, which has created a bunch of Quebecois terrorist cells, all of whom are attempting to apprehend a movie called Infinite Jest. And the movie Infinite Jest is a movie that is apparently so entertaining that if you watch it, you just continue to watch it until you die. It's like The Ring, except you just watch it on loop until you die. And it was directed by a man named James Incandenza, who also runs a New England tennis academy because David Foster Wallace is like a big tennis fan.
Yeah.
And so, and he has three sons. He's died. He's committed suicide, and he has 3 sons who are loosely based off of the.
He cooked his head, right, or something? He microwaved his head.
Microwaved his head.
So I'm just like fondly remembering the plot now. It's been a while, but go on.
And I would say like at least half of the footnotes are descriptions of James Incandenza's movies, which are all sort of like veiled homages to David Foster Wallace's taste in movies. And certain directors. So you learn about his entire film catalog throughout the thing. And the other part of it takes place in a halfway house, and you have a character who's the most deadly and feared members of a Quebecois terrorist cell are part of what's known as the Wheelchair Assassins, Les Essons de Roland de Fauteuil, as I recall. And they are, because the only way you can make it into their organization is if you lie down on a train track and basically play chicken with a train, and the
game of the next train. Yeah,
they're brave enough.
I'm surprised. Yeah,
take their wheels, but despite the fact that they're all in wheelchairs, they're the most adept, live, ninja-like assassins. So there's these absurdist elements of it. But I guess
no.
But half of it also takes place at a halfway house in Boston near the tennis academy, with all of these these addled drug addicts, and that all that to being said, nothing happens in the book. Nothing, absolutely nothing. Like you'd think you just described a kind of wacky screwball adventure, but there's next to nothing. There's no. I mean, you can kind of piece it together what happens, but all of the action that may or may not have happened is alluded to. You would it would be an effort on par with James Joyce's Ulysses to actually announce the plot of the movie. And I've even heard people say things like, I heard some interview with Wallace where he said, like, well, the structure of the story is based on the Sierpinski gasket, which is some sort of like obscure esoteric engineering mechanism.
God. Yeah.
This does not. Infinite Jest and much of Wallace's work has never struck me as a man who's not concerned with how clever he is. And for a man who spent much of his time and much of his nonfiction berating sort of postmodern 60s era, what he calls the sort of post-Nabokovian generation of writers, this is certainly not any kind of return to realism. And there's certainly plenty of, I guess, deliberate mazes that he sets forward for his reader. And ironically enough, because I've just never been able to square his writing on New Sincerity with Infinite Jest, because it's not like the guy wrote a 19th century novel. And quite frankly, and this is it's ironic because this is a writer who is absolutely cringe, although I bear him a grudging respect. Every time I read Wallace's literary theory or literary criticism, it sounds like he's talking about Jonathan Franzen. And apparently the guys were real, like, they kind of frenemies. They had, I guess, a bit of a rivalry. They both, they were friends, but they didn't see eye to eye on fiction. And I
remember reading about that.
A point that he wrote a piece after Wallace died, and I think one of the more biting things he said was like, it's interesting to hear you feel like he writes an occasion like a heterosexual man, because I can't. And again, I have not read all of Oblivion. It's been some time since I read him, but Franzen said, why did he never once write about two people being in love?
Yeah,
I can't honestly and the irony there is there's a biography out of him now, out of him called, I think the title is like, Every Love Story is a Ghost Story.
It's a ghost story, yeah.
Well, Dave, you never wrote a love story. Like you did,
right?
This is my last point I'll make. This is my last observation, and this is gonna be what cancels me. This will be the moment that cancels me, Joan. Because I read, and I hope I get this right, but I know that he had, I guess, an off again, on again relationship with a poet, a woman who, I guess,
Mary Carr. Yeah,
like I think the pea goat, the prettiest girl of all time.
Yes,
this quasi character, Madame Psychosis, in the book. Which is an allusion to metempsychosis, which is an allusion to James Joyce's Ulysses, but this is the New Sincerity, everybody. Don't worry, you don't have to like pick up on seven analogs into this text. But I heard, like, I read somewhere, and maybe I'm getting the details wrong, but like he was, I guess, cruel enough to her that at some point he tossed her out of a moving car or something like that. Something fucking terrible. But to be honest, the guy was like, that makes me like David Foster Wallace a little bit more, because he actually sounds like something other than a brain in a jar. Like,
right. That was
the most visceral, like passionate thing that I'd ever heard about the man, and I didn't think he was capable of it.
No, that was basically, in so many words, I think.
Don't throw anyone out of cars.
No, of course not. But there's a life there. That's what that's what's wrong with his legacy, sort of, is like he's become seen as this great neo-sincere sort of Buddhistic saint figure, whereas he was very like it's the same, the reason some obviously the feminist critiques of him sort of dug this up, that he was basically an asshole with the temper, and that was basically the Bret Easton Ellis's point of what was wrong with the movie about him, and also just what's kind of wrong with I mean, he was critical of Wallace himself, not to speak ill of the dead, but nevertheless, and he basically said almost exactly that Wallace, and he had maybe crossed paths with him once or twice in the 90s or something, and that basically there was a more interesting version of David Foster Wallace that was very problematic, that, you know, that said that not even just in his personal life, in which he was, you know, there's all these stories, but also things he used to write, quotes like, you know, AIDS' gift to us is that it reminds us that sex is anything but casual. I believe that's a David Foster Wallace quote that you won't find. He also, to bring in the politics of it, he was a Reagan supporter. Like, he's kind of ambiguous, like politically ambiguous. Not that I think there's anything wrong with being a Reagan supporter per se, but you know, it's not the David Foster Wallace that we've come to know. But basically,
Matt, can you square the circle of his sort of advocacy for this new sincerity and like a daunting like tomb like Infinite Jest? I mean, like, and feel free to tell me if you feel like I'm reading it wrong, because I'm afraid that I am.
No,
but like
I don't think of this as like a defense of DFW here, because again, I'd have to do kind of more of my rereading to say like, oh, this is why like he's actually like, that's not really what I'm trying to do here. But I think I hear what you're saying, and I think it's a very valid critique of the man and of his, definitely of his legacy and of his work. And I think the tension you described between the pretension and the denseness of Infinite Jest with the neo-sincerity, yeah, those things are very out of whack. A couple ways I would square that circle, if it even needs to be done, is one, I think that he wrote Infinite Jest maybe before most of these other sort of neo-sincere type opinions. I think there's something to that. Kind of when you were describing the plot of Infinite Jest right now, I hadn't really thought of it in these terms previously, but it was very obvious. Like, obviously that book, he was putting all of himself and all of his biography into that. He was a drug addict. He was a tennis player. He was a cinephile, you know, obviously a writer. It was that all-in mindset, I think, for Infinite Jest. I think what you have is a book that sort of just, he was, I mean, one criticism, I remember, one famous criticism of it was like, it appears the writer of this book just put anything that was on his mind down. And I think there is an element of that to it. I think it's kind of interesting. But I think that's the way my understanding of it would be, you know, that was that he put all of himself in that book, and all the neo-sincere stuff was kind of him later sort of trying to justify himself as a writer. Yeah. So that's kind of how, yeah.
Myself talk. I don't mean to imply, or I don't really. It's not that a book can be structurally experimental and still be. It can certainly be that and still have a sincerity to it. So I don't think that they're mutually exclusive. But yeah, I don't think that. I don't know what percentage of that book I would articulate as sincere. And it is strange. I found this true in most of his short stories. Everybody does seem there's almost no dialogue between two people.
Yeah.
Everybody is very atomized. You get into everybody's head, but very, very seldomly do two characters actually collide, whether that's like a man or a woman,
yeah,
or a friendship. He does not really wind up ever illustrating human relationships, and I guess that's part of the point of Infinite Jest. People are all really lonely, but
I think, yeah, gosh, I mean, I think you bring up a really good point. I mean, that is what interests me about David Foster Wallace, is his ability to describe that feeling of social isolation, which is why, even though I think David Foster Wallace thought he was writing for, a lot of people would say like, oh, like he's kind of, I think he's broadly perceived as more of a writer you'd read in your 20s than in your teens. But for me, he was the perfect writer to read in my teens, because I was a very like sort of isolated, like mopey teenager, you know, narcissistic in my way. And yeah, I think David Foster Wallace was pretty narcissistic. And I think that his strength as a writer was simply in his, it's quite sad, I think his real strength was in his ability to channel his own sort of brokenness, his own sort of narcissism, his own isolation so fucking well in his novels that when you read them, if you deal, and I guess we all do deal with that to some degree. I did much more as a teenager than I do now, thankfully. It makes you feel less lonely when you read it. And this is the stuff that he said about his own work and about the way he appreciated literature. So I think it's like I like David Foster Wallace a lot, but kind of just for like that one thing, that his writing is this testament to a, he always would say, frequent David Foster Wallace quote, I think it's even in that Kenyon address, the mind is a wonderful servant but a terrible master. I mean, you feel him struggling with that so keenly in all of his work. Maybe less so the nonfiction, but definitely in the fiction. And that's what I appreciate. But, and I actually, Jonathan Franzen, politically very cringe. I enjoy his novels. And I enjoy Franzen's novels in the way that I enjoy most literature. Like, David Foster Wallace is like, he's like this one-note thing of the isolated protagonist that you feel so keenly. But he's not that writer like Jonathan Franzen or like most of the other writers that I enjoy, where they are describing a more broad swath of the human experience.
I do think this is my original observation, and I don't think I think that they both of them consider themselves to be the Tolstoy and the Dostoevsky. But you hear Tolstoy being described as the vertical genius, and Dostoevsky as Tolstoy as the horizontal genius, as this kind of linear temporal genius, because he's amazing at weaving through different characters and these timelines, whereas Dostoevsky is this vertical genius because he just goes kind of straight down the human psyche. And I think Franzen is a bit more of a Tolstoyan, and Dostoevsky.
Yeah, that's a very good comparison. I think.
Yeah, and I mean, I think Franzen's like freedom was, like, if I can get over like the Democrat scoffing at all the Republican characters, like the ambition and the scope of the book was like, that is a 19th century novel.
Yeah.
And it's very,
politically
very hard to find anybody with
but stylistically impressive.
Right.
For that. Yeah. Yeah.
I think with regard to, I'm not sure to what extent DFW is or isn't sincere, but with regard to the irony in his work, I mean, I think we all know that irony sometimes does hide or is used as a tool to convey a greater sincerity. And I think you could see that in some of his writing, that like, despite the fact it's like deeply ironic, especially one story that comes to mind is in Oblivion. It's a story about a man who I think it's called Neon, who lost his will to live.
Oh, that's one of my favorite ones. Yeah.
So he just starts like trying to figure out a way to, kind of find a will to live. And so he starts sleeping with different women every night, doing other stuff that he thinks will make him, feel alive, and none of it does. And he eventually does kill himself. And this all, like, the way it's written, like, it is not really written in a sincere fashion. Like, no one is really that kind of, like, vapid, that kind of, he's almost like a Welbeck character. But so there is an element of irony, I think. But I think a story like that was very sincere, because, I mean, I'm sure, it tracked his own, beliefs about the meaninglessness of life, and of course, presaged his own ultimate suicide.
I'm surprised that he. I mean, do you guys consider him to be any of the loneliness and the enemy, and as well as the kind of formal level of the footnotes and the breadth? I'm surprised people don't. At least I don't observe him getting more credit nowadays for kind of being the prophet of the internet era.
Yeah, I don't hear people saying that, but that was another thing I wanted to say in terms of the is he based, is he cringe debate, which again is kind of, a little bit of both perhaps, but I do think that there's, a lot of times, a lot of times when someone has like a legacy that kind of gets the better of them, there's kind of peaks and troughs to the way that legacy is perceived, and definitely he had a high peak right after he died, or like a few years after he died, and then it just went so low with everyone having negative stuff to say. I think in the long run, he'll be appreciated for a number of reasons, including what you just said. That his style encapsulates kind of prefaces a little bit the internet age and all of that. I think in the long run, sort of stylistically, his legacy will focus back on things like that. What he meant to a time and a place, and how he encapsulated it.
People say this a lot of like Christopher Hitchens. If like there's one human being you could bring back to life just to see how he would react to like the madness of today. I feel exactly the same of David Foster Wallace. Like, what would he make of
right?
And I do. What would he make of what has happened to his beloved cinema? Like, what the hell?
Hitchens. I know what he would say. I think. I don't think it's very hard to imagine what Hitchens would say. Yeah. But Wallace, like that might be very interesting.
It is interesting.
I don't know.
I think it brings up the based and cringe debate a little bit because I don't even know, but like I think that most likely David Foster Wallace would be a little bit like Jonathan Franzen is now, as sort of an alarmist person. Maybe not as far left as Franzen, who is quite leftist, but an alarmist. The anti-style. An alarmist sort of anti-Trumpist, like the Republicans want to bring everything to shit sort of character. But I think there is a possibility that he would have gotten red-pilled. That's pretty cringe to say.
Book.
But
could have written about
what's that?
Made a great book about 4chan or something.
Yeah, I think that it's probably unlikely, and it's probably cringe for me to even suggest it. I just think that, put it this way, not that I endorse him throwing Mary Carr out of a moving vehicle, but he had that angrier, sort of darker, sort of willing to
all I'm trying to
transgress side.
That was the only indication that the man had a pulse.
He did have a pulse. So that's my point. Like there is, I think, that distinct possibility that he would have sort of gone off the reservation a little bit and been like, actually, not necessarily like in supporting Trump the way he supported Reagan, but like, not being willing to go along with the bullshit of like the center left and establishment. I think there is that possibility with him. Because he was really smart, as he loved to show off, and he did have that pulse. I think he's a little more of a wild card in that regard.
Yeah,
like Hitchens, I feel confident he'd just be your standard IDW guy, but DFW, he could be anywhere on the spectrum.
I think so.
It'd be great to see him on Alex Jones. Can you picture that interview?
I mean, I think you could potentially, to tell you the truth.
DFW or Hitchens?
Not Hitchens. No.
Yeah.
Hitchens, solid IDW.
Both would be really entertaining. But,
yeah. Like you could almost DFW. This is further cringe, or maybe there's something to this. He's like a little bit like how Kanye West is like entirely unpredictable. You could almost and also mentally ill. David Foster Wallace, unpredictable and mentally ill. You could almost imagine him like being the sort of Kanye West figure for Lit Bros or something.
I've heard.
But anyway, go on. Sorry.
I don't mean that we can wrap up DFW, but I've heard him. I think it was Dave the Distributist who kind of compared him to a Kurt Cobain figure.
Oh yeah.
I think it's easy to see the comparisons, but I've heard people also talk about Kurt Cobain as sort of the last rock star, and I wonder if there's any analogy or anything read worth pulling there about David Foster Wallace as kind of the last novelist in some respect.
Mm-hmm.
Not to say, and I mean, you guys are novelists. I hope that we.
No, I hear what you're saying. Yeah.
Seat off the ground, but in terms of sort of a larger than life, iconic, I think you mentioned earlier, Matt, there was supposed to be this. He was supposed to usher in this new generation of Wallacean writers, and I mean, you mentioned I think Jonathan Safran Foer or Dave Eggers.
Yeah, but it's Safran Foer as well, for sure. Yeah,
like there were probably a lot of people that wound up writing for television that were Wallace bros, but I can't say that I've encountered books with insane footnotes or a kind of Wallace edge to them, and I don't really think there's anybody that's taken that mantle. So is I don't know. Is he in some way the last real?
I think so. A little bit like what was the term you used earlier? How there's like this extinction burst that was kind of encapsulated by Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. There is, I think, a little bit of that sense about Wallace, like a maximalist, sort of the last like cis het white.
Well, that's it. The
Yeah.
last cis het, but not the last novel, not the last larger than life novelist. Like people are talking about Sally Rooney and probably other people who I don't know the names of and don't want to know about. And
Yeah.
that, it continues just without us. And
Right.
that I think that's the real black pill or white pill because we're, the next big novelist, maybe even America's not going to have like the novelist for America because we're like 5 or 6 different Americas. So
Yeah.
yeah, maybe Zero HP becomes our big novelist or Delicious Tacos or Matt here. And
There
that's
we
a
go. Well, I appreciate that, Dan.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that is a bit of a transition. I don't even necessarily want to be anything that grand. But last things you did read Dragon Day, which I appreciate. As pretty much all of our listeners know, Dragon Day is my novel, which I published with Terra House last year. I'm not gonna ask you like, oh, did you like it? Because then you're gonna feel like you have to say you liked it. But
I did. I did, Matt. I enjoyed it, and I mean, I shared with you before I even read it. I just kind of read the boilerplate description, and I realized that the main, I guess, the main setting and the main subject and theme throughout the book is, elite colleges in America, which is a pet subject,
right.
as being a veteran of one. But I was wondering, Matt, maybe I'm switching around the interviewer hat here to
No, totally. Yeah.
I don't, could you, I guess, try and provide whatever level of summary or description of your book that you would like to, because I certainly don't want to provide any spoilers, but
Oh yeah.
maybe this is something you're used to doing, just giving kind of a.
Oh yeah, I'm definitely used to doing it. The novel is about a troubled young college freshman who, very isolated college freshman, who falls under the wing of a professor with dangerous ideas. Basically, the main character is a 19-year-old college student named Toby. When we first meet him, he is in a very isolated and sort of self-conscious frame of mind, which I'll comment on in a second, and doesn't have very many friends. He's just started, and he kind of falls under the wing of this professor with ostensibly very sort of Marxist, post-structuralist, leftoid, Derridian kinds of ideas, a very, young and charismatic English professor. And then slowly, a young and charismatic English professor who's kind of seen as a leader of sort of radical 2015 style campus politics. But slowly he sort of indoctrinates Toby, the main character, into a sort of underground secret teaching he has to a very select few students, sort of like in the novel Secret History. Not exactly like that, but vaguely like that.
Donna Tartt a little bit, yeah.
Yeah, there definitely was an influence. But basically, he secretly has sort of, I would say like alt-right sort of ideas, but not like dissident right, third way type ideas per se, although that might be part of it, like a very sort of unhinged version of that. And this sort of incel type protagonist sort of falls under his influence, and things get worse from there, is how I'd sum up the novel.
Yeah, and and I much of it has to do with I guess when you start out, you do just, I guess, consider this professor to be a bit of a leftoid. He gets he has his students manage to get sort of a medievalist fired for triggering a student. It's funny, I missed I graduated from 2000 in 2005 from college. So I always was, I kind of missed. I came,
Hmm.
I graduated too early before a lot of campuses went completely insane, and I can only imagine what my alma mater is like today. Um,
Hmm.
but is this a novel that you started when you were an undergraduate, or is this? I
Yes,
assume,
very much.
the secret, um, I guess the eventual ideological nature of this charismatic professor. I'm imagining that's not something that's lived experience. And if it is, don't tell me, because I want subterranean-based dissident professors to continue to operate. But is a lot of that, I guess, drawn from your exasperation and disgust with a campus culture that you had to live through yourself?
For sure. Yeah, no, I'm not proud of this fact because the book is only about 150 pages, but I did write it on and off for like 7 friggin' years before I was finally able to finish and publish it. And I mean, to answer your question very much, most of it was written. Most of like the first part of it anyway was written when I was an undergraduate, and was very much based off of my exasperation with the campus culture of 2015. The novel's set in 2015. I purposely wanted to set it before Trump, before things went sort of really crazy, back when those kind of campus politics were still ascendant. I started writing it when I was the age of the protagonist. I started writing it when I was 19. And I'm actually going to back up to a little. It's interesting because I don't even think about this so much very often, but David Foster Wallace is on the brain. I think when I started writing it, my goal, I was still, when I was a bit of a Wallace bro, and my goal was very much to capture that sort of self-conscious, isolated type of Wallacean narrative. For the years that I was mostly influenced by Wallace, it never got very far because I just don't have, I don't even say I don't have that talent as a writer, but I can't write a David Foster Wallace novel. I like the idea of writing the isolated character, but any kind of narrative thing, Wallace wasn't doing me any favors reading him. So it's actually interesting when I kind of went through that thing where I read the Bret Easton Ellis critique of Wallace. I think that's what really helped me as a writer, because it helped me kind of move past Wallace and like Bret Easton Ellis is something of an influence, and I have X number of other influences. Like they're a better example of how to just write a narrative, I think. But I guess just because we were talking about him, I'll bring him up. I do think writing an isolated protagonist, like that was kind of again, as I said, I don't have that same kind of mentality now. I'm a lot less sort of isolated and self-absorbed. But, as a teenager, I was very much that, and kind of reading David Foster Wallace was sort of palliative. And then when I first started writing as a 19-year-old, that's definitely like where I started. Thankfully, anything else I write in the future, I think will be different. But, that it encapsulates like that period of my life. But moving on from there, I was. It's obviously not just about an isolated protagonist, but also there's this political angle, and that was all very much based on personal experience. At the time, I guess you could say I was a bit of a shit lib, or trying to redeem myself to that kind of view. But I was basically like, sort of center right, center left kind of guy, and the extremes of what I was seeing on campus was very disturbing to me, and I was trying to find my way of critiquing it. Some of it probably embarrassingly neo-sincere or just kind of cucked, as we now say. I was trying to like have my, I spent a lot of mental energy at that age, and even maybe it wasn't even in earlier drafts of the novel, trying to like justify why I, as a cis het straight whatever else white male, would have the right to have these critiques, and why maybe, basically it was this jumbled thing that I think a lot of leftward, sort of bookish guys of my generation, a bit older and a bit younger, have gone through and are probably still going through, where it's like they want to be, the nice liberal guy, but increasingly it's just impossible because they're so often targeted, and they're so often, there's the supposition that below the surface they're actually just like, another problematic white guy, and it becomes this this horrible thing. And some of that, it's not unrelated to the isolation that I think my protagonist, not unrelated to that David Foster Wallace style protagonist thing, because there was a self-consciousness to it. I mean, one of the whole things is one of the whole things is basically that the main character is worried about his penis size. Like, it's like this intense male fear of physical inadequacy, and he has this fear of the way he's perceived on a social level, and is he perceived as this crippling self-consciousness. And I think in some ways the political stuff played into that, because I don't want to sound too whiny about this, because again, it's not really the phase of life I'm in anymore, but I think in college, there, as an already kind of self-conscious guy, there is this sense of like, and there's this whole, it feels like there's a political agenda sort of against you, and that's constantly sort of picking at you, for being a straight white male. I think that is an experience that a lot of guys are having, and that's some of where the novel came from. And then moving on to one of the other things in my novel, I don't consider the whole thing a satire. I think it's closer to psychological realism in parts, but there's satirical elements, and one of the things that I satire is basically absurdist, not absurdist like in the tradition of absurdism, but rather absurd, overreaching sort of Jacques Derrida literary theory stuff. And the professor character has a system called literary philology, which holds that, maybe that was a sort of Wallacean sort of conceit as well, that sort of thing, that sort of absurd plot element. Basically, the notion that you can perform close reading of any male writer and deduce their penis size from their work is this kind of absurd postmodern theory. That's theory. What's that?
I agree with that theory. I think
yeah, no, for sure. There's obviously some kind of perhaps humorous truth to it. Not that it could ever be literally done. But I think that there probably was a certain David Foster Wallace sort of element to that plot device.
Reminded me of, he had a certain Hal Incandenza quality to him. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, one thing I've noticed about a lot of people on the dissident right is it's not entirely universal, but there is often this negative experience of college. And I know you're painting a portrait of an introvert and a unique character, but it's a story I've heard often. I don't consider myself to be an introverted person, but I had a kind of a terrible, I hated college. And I think something that I notice often is this, Franzen actually writes about this well in Freedom with the character that goes off to college. It's something that gets built up in the imagination as, you're going to meet all of the best friends that you're ever going to have.
Yeah,
you're going to, it's going to all be a amazing HBO show about life, and the sexual liberation that you're going to experience is unimaginable. And I even went to, I'm not going to do my best not to dog myself here, but I went to a college that had like a large percentage of women. Like the ratio of men to women was pretty significant, and that, as I was preparing to go to college, all my friends were like, hey, that's it. And I was just missing the hell out of male camaraderie, and there was this, I guess, sort of just lack of vitality to the campus, and I'm guessing that's how a lot of young men feel now.
Yes,
regardless of the college. I thought it would be this sort of, I would be experiencing some sort of harem situation, but get there, and I think most people that are freshly at college are actually a lot more terrified of sex than they let on, even though there are themed bacchanalian parties, and everybody presents this facade of kind of sexual freedom. There's actually I think it's a much more isolating and atomizing experience for a lot of people, and I think that's
I think so.
created by the fact that everybody in your entire ecosystem has been telling you your whole life that this is supposed to be
the best years of your life. Yeah.
Yeah. And it was.
Yeah, no. So much to dig into there. Say that again. Sorry, cut out for a second.
I could empathize with Toby, and I was not even taken under the wing of like a radical professor, but.
Yeah, right. I mean, I should add. I had a really good time in college, but like there was that edge, especially maybe freshman year or like when I first got there, of like, I guess adjusting, and I exaggerated it quite a bit. Thankfully, some of the audience may be happy to know it's not that autobiographical. A lot of it's very exaggerated. My time in college was a lot better than Toby's, but no, I appreciate you bringing that up, because absolutely that, in so many ways it's a political novel, but like the root of it was emotional. And again, not to just keep saying this, but I'm kind of I hadn't thought about it in so long that it's sort of striking to me. Yeah, like definitely was supposed to be that David Foster Wallace kind of protagonist, where it's about this character's isolation and how he does or doesn't escape it. And yeah, I appreciate you bringing the college thing up, because that's very much the feelings that I first sought to write about. Later, it got into sort of politics and the state of the West and the problems with the progressive mainstream and satirizing postmodern theory. But at its core, what I wanted to write about, what I knew that I felt keenly enough to write a novel about, was that feeling of isolation or crippling self-consciousness. I distinctly remember, not to get too personal or weepy here or anything, but like I distinctly remember being at a party in college and just not having a good time. Like I just wasn't talking to anyone or whatever. And I remember thinking, like, I want to write a novel or a story, or it ended up being like a novella about, the one guy at the college party who's not having a good time. In retrospect, that sounds a little emo and whatever else, but it was my first novel. I wrote it when I was, much younger than I am now, and started writing it. And yeah, that's very much, so to anyone listening, if that sounds too emo, maybe the book's not for you. But like, if you're interested in reading, a novel about a sort of young and isolated protagonist, that's definitely, the starting point of Dragon Day, and it becomes in time very political, which, just to finish my whole spiel about how the book came about, basically I wrote that first part. I was still kind of a shitlib and didn't really know how to end it. And basically it was after getting red-pilled, for lack of a better term, that I was able to finally bring it to a close. It felt like the natural ending. Wallingford's whole secret agenda, that was kind of added later. And it's kind of like a two-part story. It's like the isolation.
When I started reading it, that Wallingford, who's this kind of radical, rabble-rousing professor, is still a heterosexual white male. At least he's got a wife, he's got a kid.
Yeah.
He's one parent. But he is the one that's trying to oust other English faculty and stage student protests. And I was scratching my head when I began to read that, because I was like, why is this character a blonde, like a Teutonic blonde guy, maybe, but that gets, I think, further adumbrated as you read. But
yeah, sort of. I mean, on one hand, I'll say, like, it's probably not the most realistic thing in the world. I think that a lot of kind of woke campus people would know better than to have a figurehead like Wallingford. But I think, the way I'd explain it in the context of the book is that this is just a very charismatic guy, and has this kind of, strange power over people, is basically what I think it ends up being. But it is a little, I mean, I don't mean this as a criticism of my own book, but definitely that's kind of perhaps a stumbling block, is that in real life, I think you'd have a hard time having such a figurehead who's basically Teutonic in appearance. I mean, I'll just come out and say this. By the end of the book, I'm not saying he's based on Richard Spencer, but I definitely was imagining someone who looked a bit like that.
I visualize like a Richard Spencer character
he definitely has that charisma. That's the type of personality.
Interesting.
But yeah, well, thank you for reading it, and whenever I have another novel out, it won't be another 7 years before my next one, and
Matt, I have to tell this story because it somewhat ties into to Dragon Day, or at least the subject matter. Again, I graduated 2005. This is I don't think this is going to dox me. There was one tiny like one small inkling of what was to come that happened to my college when I was there. Like we had one day, it was my senior year. All classes got canceled so that we could have sit-ins and discuss race relations for the day.
Yeah.
All of the campus got shut down. And I cannot emphasize how lefty my college. Like I was the left of the left. Whatever college you're thinking of, they think of my college and they're like, those guys are crazy. Forget that. Like, but the sit-in, and this is all apocryphal. So this was all like I'm hearing this third hand from a friend of a friend of a friend of a friend. So I may get the details wrong, but apparently what like the catalyst for this whole day, which just basically the whole college got shut down, was there was a black female student at a party with a white male student who was from the South, and they were talking, and she bummed a cigarette off of him, and he handed her the cigarette, and he lit it for her, and she said, "Oh, well, thank you, like what a fine Southern gentleman you are." And the student said, "Oh, well, no, I'm just a gentleman. If I was a Southern gentleman, we wouldn't be able to be hanging out," or something like that. Like, which
it's like a party quip. Yeah,
like I think like honestly just probably like, yeah, like, and what's funny about it is just I mean, all of the people in my college who I'm sure if you took the exact same human beings and you plopped them down into like 2015 would have crucified this guy. But you had all these people like sitting, like all of the professors had to run different, I guess, I don't know, awareness seminars, or it was kind of ill organized because you didn't have like Robin DiAngelo's yet. You didn't have like a cottage industry of how to run these workshops, but it was like, the college was acting like somebody had committed suicide and we all needed to have a talk about it. Even like the most sort of like proto woke students were just like, that's all he fucking said. Like they were all just like,
yeah, but
that's kind of funny, or like he might have had a point, or maybe he's just trying to say like, it's great that we're at this college because now we get to like hang out at a party, and like I come from a part of the country where these connections don't get made. But I mentioned it because at the time I was like, this is the dumbest. I was so ashamed to be at my college that we were having this happen, and then like fast forward a decade, I'm watching some Yale undergraduate on YouTube scream at a professor. But that was just like the first tumbleweed that was rolling by the road that was the prelude of what was to come.
Absolutely, yeah. No, again, you sum it up really well. Where I think there's this expectation, and again, I actually, college in some ways lived up to this expectation for me a lot of the time, but in other ways didn't, or maybe I think it's probably worse now than it was, especially because college is online half the time. There's this sense like that those are supposed to be the years of your life, and like this sort of flowering of life even. But, and it's kind of in this way where college is also a microcosm of society at large. It very much feels like something that in so many ways has been frankly feminized and sapped of its vitality. Whether it's like, you said you go to college with a high percentage of women. That's all colleges now, because men are kind of not going to college at increasingly high rates. And it's supposed to be good because there's all these women, but actually it's not. Actually, you realize you're in a world that at one point was sort of made for you as a young man upcoming in society, but it is no longer. It's like you're no longer really wanted here. There's a feeling.
I kept waiting around to like form my Mannerbund, and like after 4 years, still this kind of like lone wolf. And there was just kind of like, I wouldn't have been able to articulate it probably until a decade later, but it was just this kind of like feminine energy to it, where there was this lack of vitality. There was no no sports teams, no sort of themed houses, no athletic events. There was no sort of like just Geist, just spirit. It was a
Right.
very spiritually dead place.
So imagine that, and then throw into it, you imagine yourself in that, and then a professor who secretly is Jack Donovan, or is secretly Jack Murphy. I shouldn't say that.
And now
yes,
perfect description of your book. That's basically you think you're dealing with a woke professor, and then it's like,
yeah, and in that lack of vitality, in that lack of Geist, there's someone who is delivering the goods cryptically, but also in a way that proves to be dangerous. And I don't think it's going to happen, but Lord knows, perhaps it could. That there could be these kind of secret maybe. And they, what, my book is kind of a cautionary tale. My book, I don't advocate what Toby eventually does, or I don't advocate what Wallingford teaches, but hell, maybe there's a decent version. Maybe if you're in college right now, maybe start a little secret society with your friends. I don't want to get in trouble for saying that, but you do kind of need that, right? You need that Mannerbund feeling sometimes, and it's kind of a little bit like what we're doing right now on this podcast. Building community online, and I don't know if you're a young college guy listening to this, maybe there's something there.
The
rebuild,
from Passage Prize, which the tagline is "Exit the Longhouse," and I think that's very appropriate here. We are trying as a culture to exit the Longhouse. That's the project of New Right. That's, I think, to some extent, your project at Last Things. And that your novel, Matt, Dragon Day, was in some sense about being in a culture that is feminized, and that is not vital for men, and a man trying to find his way out of it. And boy, does he chart an interesting course.
Yeah,
there's a lot there.
Yeah, it's a very interesting read. So I definitely advocate it. And it is.
Thanks.
It's a short read, but it's a really good one. People could probably get through it in a week. And do you have another one in the works now, Matt?
Just ideas, if I'm being honest, but eventually hope, this is probably overly ambitious to say this year, but I'm hoping, and it probably won't be like even as long. I might write a novella or even just some short stories, but more fiction should be coming from me.
Awesome.
In due time. But yeah, thanks so much for reading. And we're about hitting the 2-hour mark here, which would be one of our longer episodes. But I think 2 hours is pretty solid. I think this has been a fantastic conversation. But we should probably wrap it up. So I'll just say thanks so much for coming on, Last Things. And by the way, you like to go by Last Things on these podcasts, right?
You guys started calling me LT just because I signed off on that one day, and then I was like, I really like that. I like. Like Luke.
All right.
LT.
It's very Mannerbund.
Yes, indeed.
But I go by Last Things. Unfortunately, I'm still pseudonymous until we.
Oh no, that's fair.
Oh yeah,
that's fair.
We're all pseudonymous here, more or less.
Yeah. Well, it's always a ton of fun talking to you guys. So let's definitely do it again. And
let's do it again. Yeah. All right. Take care.
Bye.